Good morning. This is Catherine Dubberly, the Answer Lady. Many of us both machine knit and hand knit, and sometimes it can be a good idea to combine these skills, especially in my case when using garter stitch, because in my opinion it's much easier to knit that on knitting needles, and yet it makes a good hem for machine knitted items. So here is how I work with the bulky machine and hang hand knitted garter stitch on it. I think it is possible to do this on other gauges of machine, but of course you're going to have to knit a lot finer, and I tend not to hand knit smaller than worsted weight yarn. Work all of your stitches gradually, of course, to near the point of your hand knitting needle, and using your single prong tool, lift each one off the knitting needle and hang it on to the latch hooks that are the machine needles. If you need to stop for some reason, hang the knitting needle on the extended machine needle, go answer the phone or whatever, and then come back. I like to work from right to left because it allows me to put my transfer tool in my right hand. That means that the working yarn is going to be at the right. So when I begin knitting again, the carriage will need to be at the right. You can certainly reverse this process if it's more comfortable for you. Just keep in mind where the working yarn is, always at the stitch closest to the point of the knitting needle that you were hand knitting your garter stitch on. Don't get the idea that garter stitch is the only thing you can do in this manner. It's just the one I'm demonstrating on and the one that I tend to use. If you work for a little while, you're likely to find the stitches are rising up and wanting to jump off of the machine, as loose stitches will tend to do. And all you have to do is hang claw weights in the same way that you would for any other knitting you were doing on the machine. You won't see me move those weights again, but I really should try to keep them under the area where I'm hanging for best results and least dropped stitches. In a minute, you will see me make a mistake and miss a stitch. I didn't obviously see it at the time, or I would have stopped to correct it. You will also see me miss some and correct them as I go. And that's not very difficult. There is not very much pressure on these stitches, so the tendency to run is not great. If you drop one, just catch it and hang it up correctly. You may notice that I'm working with a bamboo hand knitting needle. I really prefer bamboo needles. Of course, everybody has their personal taste, so I'm not suggesting that they are innately superior. However, the minute that I tried using them, I felt so much more comfortable and got so much more enjoyment out of the knitting that I would suggest that unless you're just in love with yours, give some bamboo ones a try. They're not terribly expensive, and something about the feel of them seems to make it easier to control the stitches and more relaxing on your hands. Over my right knuckle when I'm working now, you can see the mistake that I forgot, and I will come back and fix it in a little bit as soon as I discover it. Once everything is hung, hang the working yarn, which should be hanging down in this case on the right side of the machine because that's where I hung my first stitch. Thread it through the carriage as usual and make sure that you go properly through all of the yarn feeders. Now I have discovered my mistake, and there is a stitch that needs to be hung towards the middle of the work that I missed. I'm going to lift all of the stitches to its left on the three-prong tool and gradually move them in groups over one needle to the left to make room for the stitch. This stitch has actually run for a couple of rows, so I'll reknit it in the proper garter stitch pattern, working once from one side of the work and once from the other side of the work to recreate it as it ought to be, and from there we can proceed. Now I can knit whatever I want to, but in this case I'm knitting a dishcloth and I'm going to end with the garter stitch pattern as well. So here is how we get the work off of the knitting machine and back onto knitting needles. I have ended with my carriage on the right, and I'm going to turn it all the way up to the highest setting on the stitch dial because it's much easier for me to pick up the stitches onto the knitting needles if this row is loose. Then I'm going to knit to the left. Now the working yarn will be on the left, which is important because as I load my stitches onto the point of the knitting needle, the hand knitting needle, I'll be working from the right again. That means that the stitch on the right will end up near the butt of the knitting needle, and I need the working yarn at the point. So that stitch will be on the left as I work across the machine. Obviously, if you're going to load the stitches from left to right, you would reverse this procedure as well. You can do this one of two ways. You can run your needle tip through more than one stitch at a time while they still hang on the machine, and then withdraw the machine needles from the stitches by pushing them forward to open the latch and pulling them back through. Sometimes it works, but it's actually safer and just as easy to lift with your needle point, your hand knitting needle point, one stitch off one latch needle at a time. I hope you have as much fun combining your knitting techniques as I do. Visit me on my website for more great ideas, freebies, and of course patterns and books for sale. Happy knitting, and bye now.